Good afternoon, class, and welcome back to our final class session. I hope that everyone had a great semester. I've enjoyed spending time with you. I've heard from several of you that you've enjoyed the class, so I'm really glad for that. I want to remind you to fill out your student opinion of instruction surveys. Those are really useful for us to get some feedback on the class. I want to mention that this class actually did not exist in our curriculum until a few years ago. And that's because what happened was Dr. Kane, who is one of the sociology professors, had been teaching at another university and wanted to repeat a course that she had taught there that she really enjoyed and put this in the curriculum. And we've been teaching probably 3 sections, if not more, every semester since. And it seems to be a really great addition to the curriculum. It's also a great way for us to introduce sociology to students who haven't had it before. Some of you have, but those of you who have not, as you know, you didn't need the introduction to sociology class to take this. But I want to invite you to take that class if you haven't, as well as some other sociology classes that we offer. So the exam will be tomorrow, Tuesday. It will open at 8 a.m. and will be up until Wednesday evening at 11:59 a.m. p.m. p.m. that is. So in other words, 2 full days. And you have the study guide from me, and I hope that was self-explanatory. I didn't get any questions from any of you for me to cover today in this review, so please let me know if there's anything you need explained. But you need to let me know today, and I'll be glad to send out an email to explain it further. I want to thank all of you for being really engaged this semester, very reflective on the readings. I really appreciated that, and you're asking very challenging questions. Some of you are learning some information for the first time, which is great. That's what this course is all about, or any course is all about. And it was nice to hear from some of you who said this is different from your major. You're doing something like, I don't know, construction management or hospitality studies or chemistry, and that this is different from that. And so I'm glad to kind of expand your options in your education. This is something that's really great, I think, about the American education system, is that we give you these liberal arts degrees where you're getting a wide range of knowledge across humanities and sciences and social sciences to supplement your major. That's not true in some countries. When I lived in Poland, you just took whatever your major was, you took almost nothing but that major for 5 years. Now it's 3 years. But, I feel like to some extent you learn a lot about your major, but, what about these other aspects of college life that you don't get to really participate in, such as learning to write through your English classes, picking up a new musical instrument, learning sociology. So rah-rah for American liberal arts education. What are some of the things that we have learned this semester? Let's think back to our very first assignment, which was to watch the video Race, the Power of an Illusion. If you remember that, several of you had a lot of really good reflective comments on that and what you learned from that video. And that was really our first introduction to the term that I think has been useful throughout the semester, which is social construction. So great exam question, right? What is social construction? Remember that idea that race we think is biological, right? That's what we all assume, that there are these biological differences between humans. But remember what you learned about the nucleotides and DNA and all of these ways in which we can't really find distinct differences that make humans so significantly different from one another. And so that's what we mean by race being a social construction, that humans, that particular societies, particular nations have come up with particular ideas about what it means to be a particular race and what that gives you in terms of status, in terms of privilege, in terms of what types of abilities you're seen as naturally possessing. And remember, we've throughout the semester, we've really critiqued that. We've really seen that there is nothing sort of natural that is part of your race or ethnicity that is something that we can rely on that's somehow reproducible across generations. We also learned about the social construction of gender, right? The way that males and females are also assumed to be very different, where there's this assumption that there's a binary and that this set of characteristics belongs on one side of the binary, another set of characteristics belongs on the other side of the binary. And if you remember reading about intersex, that's a real challenge to that, right? So, what does it mean for someone to be born with ambiguous sex characteristics who do not fit into that binary? And this is something that the women's movement, as well as the LGBTQ movement, are really calling attention to today. And there's more discussion about that. There's discussion about third gender. Okay, what about the fact that several societies, including indigenous societies here in the Americas, have had a third gender for who knows how many years, how many, possibly thousands of years, right? That was accepted. It was not seen as something that was a stigma. It was seen as something, in some cases, you're elevated when you are part of that third gender. Some Native American tribes see that as giving you some kind of a spiritual importance because you can see life from both sides, right? You're fully human if you embrace all of these gender characteristics that we usually put into one classification versus another. So social construction, hopefully you are clear about that. We can actually apply that to other things as well, right? We could apply social construction to social class. What do we assume that are the characteristics of one social class versus another? Usually we're using this in these categories that we are assuming are biological, but social construction really is, almost like society sat down one day with some building blocks and figured out what's going to be where and what this is going to mean. And it gets reproduced in our culture until we start to challenge it and start to do something different. One of the things that I think is very relevant to this class is the social construction of criminality. What does it mean for something to be against the law? And that's come up in a couple of ways, right? You read about learning to be illegal, and we've constructed what it means to be illegal in this country. We've put together a set of laws that say if you're an immigrant and you don't meet this set of characteristics, didn't come under these particular conditions, then that makes you an undocumented or illegal immigrant, right? What about other types of crimes, such as drug offenses? We now have several states that have completely decriminalized marijuana and even other drugs. I believe Oregon State in this past election just decriminalized a whole list of drugs, including mushrooms that are used for hallucinatory purposes. So what does it mean to be a criminal? And isn't that conditioned on what the law is? In my intro class, I usually give lots of examples of stupid local laws. So look that up on the internet, stupid local laws. You're going to find some really interesting state laws as well as city laws that are on the books that have to do with odd things like bingo. There are some laws about bingo in North Carolina. And my favorite one is that it is illegal to take a lion to the movies in Baltimore. So what is that about? So again, social construction is something that I think you're going to find that you're going to see it everywhere now that you know what we mean by that. So just a short survey of what we've gone through this semester, what we've learned about. We've learned about racial formations, right? The way that over the centuries we started to divide people into these races, and it had to do a lot to do with racism, with with colonialization, with the way that certain races were enslaved, the way that the Irish used to be seen as a race in the United States, and then eventually became white, like the others. We kind of created this whiteness that before in Europe, there wasn't such a thing. It was you were Irish, you were Italian, you were Polish, you were German. We read about optional ethnicities, right? The way that some people can maybe choose which ethnicity they're going to identify with. Maybe they have come from mixed heritage and they choose which of the parentage that they identify their ethnicity as. We've read about the racial wealth gap, if you remember the difference between income and wealth, and the way that blacks in particular have just a fraction of the amount of wealth that whites have. And you learn something about why and how some of that has a lot to do with racial, not only racial profiling, but redlining of neighborhoods, in the way that neighborhoods historically were created with homes that would discriminate against people of color, and how homes really are, as someone said, it's like your home is like your bank. It's your wealth bank, and if your home is not worth as much as the same home in another neighborhood, or if you're not able to get a mortgage, which people of color are more likely to be turned down for, that really affects the building of wealth. So just be clear about the difference between income and wealth. I think that would be very useful. And it's also useful for you to have a critical perspective when you read the news and try to sort out these things. You read about, I've talked already about intersex and the way that there are these challenging voices now that are asking, why is it that someone is making a decision about someone's sex when they're a baby? Why are doctors and parents deciding if somebody is born with ambiguous sex traits, which one you're going to be? And as you read, mostly they get changed to girls. And what are the implications for that? You read about someone who grew up, not knowing that they had been changed and not feeling that they were the sex that their parents had decided they were. And so, what about the rights for people to have that kind of decision making, autonomy, authority over their own bodies? You read an interesting article about African American, uh, why won't African Americans get married? So you might look back at that and these stereotypes, that that there's something wrong with African American women in particular, that they're seen as Jezebels, as being sexually permissive. But in fact, the story is more complicated than that, um, in terms of what it means to get married. So you might look back at that. Clearly, some women are making the decision um, based on the possibility that they are going to end up being the sole income earner or the main income earner for a family, and it becomes risky to take on an adult into a household under that condition. We also, as you know, higher rates of African American men being imprisoned. So this has a lot to do with why women end up not having a partner, African American women. And you had some really interesting things to say on your discussion board about this comparison. I asked you to compare hookup culture on college campuses and African American women who are single and have children, and why are the African American women stigmatized and seen as somehow immoral, all kinds of other names that they're called, but hookup culture is seen as something kind of normal on campuses. This is the way things are done now. Although, as some of you noticed, and I've noticed, yeah, college women are very much stigmatized, more so than college men, for doing that. But think about how both class and race and gender come into that, right? That hookup culture on college campuses among a lot of white students, right? So is there something racial about the way these women are stigmatized? And is there a way in which social class is involved? Is there something about being a middle class, upper middle class college student that somehow exempts you from that kind of moral judgment that working class women have to go through? So it's a really interesting question, I think, example of what we call intersectionality. So that has come up, right? This intersection between race, class, and gender, the topics of our course, that they all sort of interrelate to one another, and the way that if you are at the bottom of the hierarchy in one of those groups, you're going to have more disadvantages. So, intersectionality, another good exam question. You read about the also the racial achievement gap. If you remember that, that was the one um, about college, about education, and the way that segregated neighborhoods have a lot to do with the differences in racial achievement, because those neighborhoods are going to be more likely to have uh, African Americans, lower income, and are going to have poor or poorer chances because their schools are less supported financially. And that has a lot to do with the fact that it is still property taxes that primarily pay for public schools. And do we need to rethink that? Obviously, property taxes are going to be very different in one neighborhood versus another. You read about Civilize Them with a Stick, that was the one that was about the Native American boarding schools, which sounds like it was a real eye opener for you to read about that. They, as far as I know, they do not still exist, but that article did a good job of showing not only how extensive they were, but how one person felt about it growing up in that, and just how frustrated she was, and eventually protested the situation there. Racializing the glass escalator, remember that is how black male nurses are treated differently. Sometimes they are mistaken for being janitors, and that the glass escalator is related to an article that was written about men, particularly white men, who are going into occupations that were traditional for women, like nursing, like social work, like being preschool teachers, and that somehow it turned out to be an advantage for them, and they moved up the ladder. They moved up this escalator. But what about black men? So, as you read, they have a much harder time doing that. They're not going up the glass escalator, and they are also sometimes um, having a lot of issues with either racism of people who don't want to be treated, white people that don't want to be treated by black male nurse, or again, assumed that they are some kind of other occupation than nurse. Jezebel at the welfare office, if you remember that, that was the article that talked about how they basically looked at the records to see how the welfare social workers wrote about black women who were applying for welfare, and just how judgmental they were, right? That they were making all kinds of assumptions about their sexual activities. They were critical of them for not choosing a good baby father. They were also, um, you know, trying to get these women to promise that they were somehow how going to behave in order to get welfare. So the way these stereotypes particularly are placed on black women. Evicted, the book Evicted, I hope that you will continue to pay attention to this question of housing, because it is a critical one. There are places like Seattle, Washington, like San Francisco, California, where their homeless populations have just absolutely exploded. And there are tent cities. There are people who just cannot afford the enormous cost of housing in those places. And what does this mean? What is the responsibility? Is it a city responsibility, a state responsibility, a national responsibility? Um, does it have to do with wages? Do wages need to be higher? Does there need to be some kind of job expansion? Um, do we need to rethink what kind of housing is out there and for whom? So lots of questions that are continued to be with us. Um, and I'll give you a story. My nephew lives in Seattle, where there are a lot of homeless, and he's been very attentive to the problems of the homeless. He's been putting together box lunches for people, and he recently had his car stolen. And when he got it back, it turned out that whoever stole it had been living in it. Either someone who stole it or somebody who got it from someone who stole it was living in his car. And and my nephew is very reflective about that, and he's not really angry because he's saying, it's another example of why is it that people have to resort to stealing cars in order to just have a safe, warm place to sleep. The book Evicted also is getting a lot of attention, as I mentioned, and a lot of national attention. And I would say if you want to keep up with what's going on, check out that website I sent you called the Eviction Lab that your author is running right now. And it's really interesting because it has statistics, and it has statistics about COVID and evictions, as well as stories, short video clips of people who've been evicted. So I'm hoping that his effort is really going to raise a lot of awareness for this problem that perhaps a lot of people were not aware of. And some of the final things that we studied, remember Nickel and Dimed was about the woman Barbara Ehrenreich, who is a well-paid professional journalist, but decided to go undercover and do this experiment and work as a maid and work as a Walmart worker, a minimum wage worker, to see if she could make it. And if you remember the story, she barely had any money left at the end of the month after her just dire basic necessities were paid. And she also saw and met so many people who were also precariously housed. They were living in hotels and looking for ways to figure out where to live because they couldn't make it on minimum wage jobs. So in general, if you're new to sociology, I hope you've learned something about how we do research on these questions in various ways. We are a social science. So we're not just about, preaching about problems, but we are about actually doing research on them and coming up with strong information about what's going on. So you saw an example with Matthew Desmond, who did what we call an ethnography. He went there and he basically lived among these two communities and tried to understand the situation from the perspective of those who were facing eviction. There are sociologists who do interviews, and that's part of what he does is interviews. There are many sociologists who do statistical research. They use surveys, they analyze census data, they analyze surveys that have been done by other people. Another good source of information is existing sources, census data, all kinds of other information that's out there that we can analyze, and media representations. So there's a whole host of ways that we do research in our profession. I also hope you learned something from some of the critical voices in the book, the readings, and in the PowerPoints about Native American images on products, about boarding schools, about how the intersex communities, questioning these practices of doctors, how you learned about race, class, and gender privilege. If you remember the invisible knapsack, what is that privilege that you're carrying around with you as a white person that you, on a daily basis, don't even notice? And how do you see life differently and experience life differently because you've got that invisible knapsack? And there's more to learn about all of this. I want to point out the importance of understanding history, that history is critically important to understand how these social constructions happened, how these inequalities got embedded into our system, into our politics, into our economy, into our culture, and the way that we can think about how can we make a difference to get some of these inequalities uh, understood and paid attention to. Another term that we talked about earlier in the semester, I just wanted to return to, was cultural relativism, if you remember that, right? Cultural relativism is looking at someone's culture, but through the eyes of the people in that culture, not through your own eyes. So it's a non judgmental way to understand another culture. That's called cultural relativism. The opposite of that is what we call ethnocentrism, right? So ethnocentrism is judging another culture based on the values of your own culture. And so, one thing that we as social scientists, sociologists try to do is to have a culturally relativist perspective on other cultures. I've talked about intersectionality already in this video, but just to reiterate that think about how that came up in the Desmond book, in the book Evicted, and how um, even though there were many poor African American men, for example, in the book, that women in particular uh, were, and women, black women, women of color, had some particular challenges because of that intersection of being African American, being female, and being lower class. You read about how most of the people who are in housing court tended to be women. So I think it's a good example of how those intersecting categories are are really affecting people, and some of the stories in the book Evicted give us some good examples of that. Just talk about COVID for a minute, which is that one thing that is going on now is that COVID is holding a mirror to our society. We are seeing how it's disproportionately impacting people of color. Um, we do know that men, for some reason, have a higher risk of dying, which they're trying to understand, but women are catching it at very high rates because they tend to be on the front lines of a lot of these care work, as well as things like education, right? So we're even hearing of teachers, unfortunately, who are dying, young teachers. There is a book that I'm going to get my hands on called Apollo's Arrow that just came out, and it is by someone named Nicholas Christakis, and he is both a sociologist and a physician, and he's writing about how coronavirus is affecting us in our society. So I look forward to reading that. But I have a feeling that one thing that you're going to get from that book, if you get to read it, is the importance of sociology for understanding the times that we're living in right now, understanding the impact of this disease of COVID on society. For example, I just read that many doctors are choosing to close their practices. They either can't make a living um, if they do procedures that aren't related to COVID, or they are just worried about their own exposure and decided to preserve their own lives. So think about that impact on society when you start to lose this whole system of healthcare workers. And I don't want to say whole system, we're not going to lose the whole system, but we might lose it in certain pockets, right? In certain rural areas, for example. How is that going to impact people who are disadvantaged already disproportionately? Other impacts on society, look, our president got sick. We could have lost our president. We could lose other political leaders that have come down with it. It's spreading in the White House. If you're following the news, yesterday, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has been exposed again to COVID. He went through it already, got very sick and came out of it, but he's now quarantined again because he's been exposed. And just this is coming home locally because the cases are rising here. And I just read about two pairs of siblings who died over the weekend that in two different families. And one pair of siblings were really important reminders of the black neighborhood in Greenville, the very important black neighborhood that was bulldozed to put up the town commons. And there's a lot of attention now to trying to keep that memory alive for those who really miss that very vibrant neighborhood, and the church that used to be there, Sycamore Hill. And I think I've mentioned the memorial that is there in Town Commons that was just opened to remember both the community and that church. And so, two of the members of that community have now left us. And again, the impact not only on their family but on a community when you lose that connection. So, in general, just how disease can destabilize society. There's a picture of thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of people lined up in their cars in Dallas, Texas, for just to get bags of food. So people who, lost their jobs and probably have never experienced poverty before, have never experienced food insecurity before. So that's something that poverty can actually destabilize society, and disease contributing to poverty is very much part of that. On a more positive note, let's think about social change and the fact that social movements, as I mentioned last week, are very much a part of social change. Getting involved in elections also is another way to forward social change. There are a number of immigrants who are not citizens but got involved in getting the vote out. So they were able to help mobilize people to vote even though they couldn't vote themselves. So there are ways that you can actually multiply your own vote. And as I mentioned, a lot of social movements are behind the very rights that we take for granted today that we did not have in the past. So just a note about your final exam. The exam will have less, let me say it this way. The questions that you have already been tested on, in other words, the readings that you've already been tested on and lecture material, some of the questions about those may be more general, where the questions about the readings that you've had more recently that you haven't been tested on, which is last week, there may be a bit more detail in those questions. So just keep that in mind. You might want to do a little more review of the readings you've just had, okay? But take the study guide and look through everything. Know it well. And remember, I don't ask tricky questions, but I do want you to know the material well. A reminder that I'm dropping the lowest mini test grade, and I'm going to do that when I calculate the final average. So that has not been done yet. Canvas can't really do that for me automatically because I have to go in and manually look at each one of your grades to find out which one's the lowest one. So I will be doing that later. If you did extra credit, if you did if you decided to do 1 week or more where you posted 4 times or more, or on 4 different discussion boards or more, I will be looking through those to give you extra credit. So again, I'll calculate that at the last minute. It's not something that Canvas can automatically do for me. So your final class, the crowdsource experiment, worked out really well. I've never done that before, and I'm going to do it again. I've gotten really good reviews of that, so check it out. I have gotten to look through most of them, and there's more that I'm really looking forward to watching some of your videos, listening to some of the music, and one thing is that it's just really telling about how you got into this class and are relating it to what you're finding out there in popular culture and in films and other ways. So I really appreciate that. Check out Kiona Knight too. If you remember back when she introduced herself to the class the first day, she said, "I'm about to do my first video, and it's about skincare." And I watched it, and great job, Kiona. So look for her. You can find the spelling of her name in the crowdsourcing final discussion board, but you can also go back to that first one. It's Kionna Knight, Knight. So good job, Kiona, and I'm going to try your skincare remedy, aloe. So finally, consider sociology as a minor or a major. We're a great department. We've got really interesting courses. or a gender studies minor. That's something that is housed in the Department of Sociology as well. Let me tell you what we're teaching next semester. We're teaching courtship and marriage, global understanding, where you get to video link with students in other countries, introduction to sociology. And we have a special section of introduction to sociology, which is related to health. If you're going to be going into healthcare, I know that is selected for certain nurses, so I don't know how many seats are available in that. Modern social problems is another one where you get to talk about even more social problems than the ones we talked about. Sociology of human sexuality, introductory medical sociology, gender and society, law and social change, social inequality, and protest and activism. So lots to choose from, and check us out not only next semester, but future semesters as well. I want you to also have a happy Thanksgiving and winter holidays. I want you to stay safe. We have more hope for a vaccine now. They've announced 2 different vaccines that have really high rates of success. Come see me once we're back on campus. I'd love to meet you in person. And one more thing I'll mention is the survey that you filled out for me about evictions. I got 19 responses. I appreciate those. I'm going to summarize those for you, and I'll send those out in case you're interested. Some very interesting findings. Stay well, everyone. Thank you again for a great semester, and good luck in your future studies. Thank you.